2731 A new kind of enemy. She escaped the memory of the moonlit night, feeling haunted by it. Noctis, the blessed of the moon, there were other memories of him in the dark sea of her shattered self, as well. There, a memory showed Noctis teaching her to steer the chain breaker. There, a memory showed her Noctis donning a black mantle and a wooden mask. There were memories of the one in the north, as well. And the rest, she absorbed those memories greedily, slowly rebuilding the foundation of who she had been. The Forgotten Shore, the Kingdom of Hope, the Tomb of Ariel, her childhood home in NQSC, the secluded manor of the immortal Flame Clan, the opulent compound of the great clan Valor. And so much more. The eerie years she had spent having forgotten most of herself, moving through life like a blind person lost in fog. As the rough contours of whom Song of the Fallen had been slowly took form, she was overcome by a subtle anxiety. Nothing in those memories explained how she ended up shattered into a million memories, drifting in the dark space between seconds. Nothing hinted at what had happened to her, and what purpose she pursued in clinging desperately to the ghost of her actual self. The past is the past, and the future is no more. But the present, what about the present? Disturbed, she slowed down for a short while, then extended her tendrils to more recent memories. She wanted to know what was happening now, not what had happened back then, but the answer was elusive. So much so that she feared that only completing the whole picture would allow her to find out the truth. She did find a hint, though. Peculiarly enough, the best hint she had found was not hidden in her own memories. Instead, it was hidden in the memories of a different being, which nevertheless seemed to constitute a vast part of her life. That being felt peculiarly familiar, somehow. Ah, it's him, the cruel boy who had wanted to leave her to die. Only, naturally, he was not a boy anymore. Even if he was still just as cruel, if not more so. The Lord of Shadows. Sensing a scent of an answer, she delved into the memories she had shared with, or possibly stolen from, him. Show me, where were you when the Dreamspawn came? The world where Sunny had been born did not welcome him anymore. In fact, it rejected him ferociously. It was a little discomforting, but then again, if he was honest with himself, Earth had never treated him nicely. If anything, it had always been a cruel and uncaring mother, leaving him to fend for himself while surrounded by cold winds and hungry wolves. Metaphorically speaking, naturally, since not even the wolves had survived its poisoned expanse. Now, nightmare creatures ruled its ruined wilderness, while people survived in vast cities like NQSC. The fortunate lived quite nicely, but the unlucky wretches like him did not. So, he could not bring himself to miss Earth. He still had to visit occasionally, though. The reasons for his visits were rarely benign, and today was no exception. Things were not going well for the human domain as of late. It was only a month or so since Sunny returned from the Eternal City, but a lot had happened since. Problems were piling up, and even with 7 bodies, he was struggling to address them all, especially because he had to maintain SE Cressy and hide his existence. How does this even make sense? Before, it used to take roughly a month for a trade caravan to travel between the Weeping Goddess and Ravenheart. But now, a day had been added to that time. That was not because the merchants had become lazy, and neither was it because some powerful nightmare creature had forced them to change routes. Rather, it was because the distance between Ravenheart and the former citadel of Clan Sorrow had changed, which was quite disconcerting. The Dream Realm had always been full of bizarre occurrences, but if its geography was shifting, there was only one explanation. It meant that more of the waking world was seeping through the realm boundary, plunging into the nightmare. The pieces of his homeworld were being swallowed by the realm of the Forgotten God, forcing them to rethink the timeline of total resettlement. As if they did not have other problems to deal with. The greatest and most eerie of those problems was, naturally, the name of Astarion, the Dreamspawn, spreading across both worlds like a plague. That quiet and seemingly innocuous plague made all other issues troubling the human domain seem trivial in comparison. Sunny's expression darkened as he thought about the Dreamspawn. He did want to find the correct words to describe how uneasy that man made him feel. It all happened just like Cassie had predicted it would, back after he escaped Mirage City. The name of the Dreamspawn spread like a virus, infecting anyone and every one who heard or beheld it. Those infected by the knowledge of Astarion became carriers of the disease, helping it spread further. Some only showed mild symptoms, blurting out the eerie name without even realizing what they were saying from time to time. In some, the disease seemed to progress much further, affecting the very way they thought and influencing their actions. There were half a dozen small cults proselytizing the name Astarion, like the Church of the Moon that was gaining popularity in the former territories of the Sword Domain. There were also secular organizations like private clubs and black market gangs doing the same. The cumulative power of these sleeper agents was not at all great. In fact, it was negligible and nothing short of pathetic. If Sunny and Nephis wanted to, they could have wiped them all out in a day. But that was the damnedest thing. For the first time in his life, Sunny had met an enemy that made all his strength meaningless. It was not that he and Nephis were weaker than Astarion, they were not, by far, it was just that Astarion attacked in a way that made using strength to repel him impossible. They could not wipe out thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of innocent people. Although, possibly, they should have. Because if they did not, the number of people who had been infected by the knowledge of Dreamspawn would soon reach millions, and hundreds of millions after that. Until every single person in the world, both worlds, rather, was infected by the name of Astarion. What were they going to do then? Entering an abandoned underground factory in the outskirts of NQSC, Sunny uttered a curse. Hell if I know. His usually light tone was dark and heavy. 2732 Quiet Plague. Sunny walked across the desolate floor of the factory, his expression dim. He felt bitter. It was one thing to encounter an enemy who used his own strength against him. An insidious and cunning enemy, one different from both the malevolent nightmare creatures whom Sunny had slain in the past and from the callous humans whom he had brought down from their tainted thrones. However, what really filled him with distaste was that they had been cautious and vigilant, yet still ended up being blindsided by Astarion. Sunny and Nephis had known that the Third Sovereign would become a dire adversary immediately after ending the Godgrave War. Even when they had been building a new world order and learning how to guide humanity in its days of existential crisis, they spared time and energy to prepare for the eventual return of the Dreamspawn. They committed vast resources to searching for the few pieces of information about him that Anvil and Kisong had failed to erase. They had created a network of informants across both worlds to watch for the signs of his emergence. They rushed to master their new powers as Supremes and grow stronger, so that no enemy of the same rank could threaten what they had built. But all their preparations had turned out to be woefully insufficient, because now that the new threat was finally starting to reveal itself, there was precious little they could do to stop it. The Shadow Clan and Cassie had identified all the cells of Astarion's newly initiated followers, but eradicating them was not an option. Even if it were, it would serve no purpose, since too many people outside the small groups of thoroughly infected were already aware of his name. Worst of all, Sunny did not even know what they could have done differently if they had discovered the spreading corruption sooner. He could not help but feel infuriatingly powerless. Sunny did not experience fear often these days, but Astarion did make him feel an unpleasant sense of apprehension. One of the most threatening things about the Dreamspawn, meanwhile, was that they still knew very little about him, even to this day. And it was very much by design. Their investigations had borne some fruit in the past month. Old Jest knew a bit, even if his trustworthiness was in question. Morgan had contributed a few crumbs of information, as well. The most important piece of knowledge, and the most unnerving too, unexpectedly came from Seishan. Seishan, who had inherited some of Kisong's legacy, revealed to them why the sovereigns chose to seal Astarion on the moon instead of simply killing him. It was not because they were wary of facing him in battle. Rather, it was because Astarion could not be killed. That devious bastard, the Dreamspawn, was not technically immortal. However, he had become a unique existence as he climbed the path of ascension, a being who was more so an idea than a creature of flesh and blood. A demon of thought, rather than hellfire and brimstone. For as long as the idea of Astarion dwelled in human minds, he could not be destroyed. Therefore, to kill him, all one had to do was kill everyone who carried the knowledge of the Dreamspawn in their minds. Therein lay the problem, though. Anvil and Kisong had been the carriers of the knowledge about Astarion, as well. So, the only way for them to kill him was to kill themselves first, or at least find a way to erase all information about him from their own minds. However, if they erased the memories of Astarion from their minds, they would forget why they needed to kill him, in the first place. They would forget how to kill him, too. Driven into a dead end by that paradox, the best they had managed to do was trap him on the moon by culling those who composed his eerie domain, and continuing to suppress his influence from Spria Ding over the decades. That was a valuable piece of information, indeed, even if it did nothing to assuage Sunny's worries. If anything, he grew more and more despondent the more they learned about Astarion. They were still lacking one of the most important pieces of knowledge about the Dreamspawn, though. It was the knowledge of what, exactly, the threat of his spreading name was. Up until now, all the people infected by the knowledge of Astarion, those they had managed to identify, at least, were only showing one symptom of the mental disease. They were all helping that knowledge spread further. The infected did not kill, did not rob, and did not harm the human domain in any way. They did not seek to undermine the Immortal Flame clan or disturb the current balance of power. By all accounts, they were still upstanding citizens. If anything, those who were affected deeper were more selfless and altruistic than an average person. There seemed to be no purpose to the spreading infection except for the growth itself. The most eerie part of the quickly escalating crisis was how mundane and utterly normal everything seemed. Of course, Sunny did not believe for a second that things would continue the same way. He did not need to be connected to the great tapestry of fate and possess an uncanny intuition to know that there was some kind of sinister purpose behind Astarion's attempts to propagate his name as far and wide as possible. They just did not know what the purpose was. Today, however, they could find out, or at least start to understand the mechanisms of how that purpose was going to be accomplished. Sunny stopped near an elevator door, where a ragtag team of Shadow Clan agents was resting on concrete blocks. He looked at them intently, then asked, "How is the prisoner?" One of them, June, offered him a pale smile. "He is in top shape, boss." Everything went smoothly. It was eerily smooth, actually. There was no resistance at all. Sunny frowned. Still, good job. Leaving the agents behind, he entered the elevator. Today, they were finally going to interrogate a person who had not simply been infected by the Dreamspawn's name. They were going to interrogate an actual subject of Astarion's domain. 2,733 turncoats of humanity. The deepest level of the abandoned factory was dark and quiet, illuminated only by the light of radiant memories. Usually, such enchanted lanterns looked warm and inviting, but as pieces of cement scraped under his feet in the dead silence, Sunny could not help but find their familiar radiance eerie instead. There were no members of the Shadow Clan here, no government specialists, and no firekeepers either. The only people waiting for him at the end of a desolate hall were a blind seer and the last daughter of the Immortal Flame clan, the ruler of humanity herself. They were Neffys and Cassie, naturally, which temporarily made the old underground factory the most exalted place in all of existence. Sunny greeted them somberly. "Long time no see." Neffys gave him a peculiar look, making him smile faintly. He had, in fact, seen her this morning. Naturally he had, considering that they always woke up together. However, even a few hours of separation could be considered a long time, and he was entitled to his subjective opinion. Cassie simply nodded, then turned to a heavy metal door. The cell where the prisoner was being held had been reinforced to contain an awakened. There was a complicated weave of runes shimjying on the alloy, as well, having been drawn by Cassie herself to isolate this hidden space from the outside world. They did not know what kind of threat the prisoner could pose, exactly, so they had prepared for as many complications as they could. Even though the man locked inside was hidden from view, or possibly because of it, the very sight of the imposing cell made Sunny feel a hint of an ominous premonition. For some reason, he was reminded of the dungeon hidden under the ruined cathedral of the Dark City. It was there that he had found the ancient corpse of a nightmare spell priest, read the dreadful prayer to Weaver carved into the floor, and inherited Weaver's mask. Hail Weaver, was it? They had worked hard to catch the man locked inside the enchanted cell. It's a bit peculiar, isn't it? Remembering all the efforts that went into arranging today's interrogation, Sunny could not help but think about how incongruous it all was. Here they were, putting in work hours to stave off the end of the world, as if it were the most mundane thing to do. At some point, world-ending threats had become the new norm, so much so that even the emergence of a creepy mind-altering sovereign felt like nothing new, which was not to say that they underestimated how perilous the Dreamspawn really was. Sunny often saw Neffys standing on the balcony of the ivory tower, gazing down at the world below with a distant expression. Every time, he knew that her mind was elsewhere, lost in the billions of small flames burning brightly in the vast expanse of her splendid domain. Some of those flames grew brighter over time. New fires ignited in the darkness as children were born or learned about changing star and were inspired by her. But at the same time, too many flames were extinguished every day. Neffys felt their absence, and even if she did not show it often, he knew that she grieved the loss of their light. It was just that now, not all of the flames that disappeared necessarily meant that somewhere out of there, a person had died. Some of them, as Neffys suspected, simply ceased to be subjects of the longing domain, becoming servants of Astarion instead. Her suspicions were not easy to prove, though. Even if Nephis felt a connection to billions of people, it was not like she knew their names or their faces. Instead, she only knew their desires, the fragile flames of longing burning in their hearts. So even when compared against the list of documented deaths that happened across the two worlds on any given day, she could not determine if there was a missing flame not mentioned in the report. So, they limited the list of potential turncoats from all of humanity to only the awakened, going from billions of potential suspects to only slightly more than 1 million. Sadly, that proved to be too vast a number, as well. Therefore, they changed tactics. Although Nephis was connected to billions of people, sensing the flames of their longing, she could not fathom all of them at the same time. As a result, not everyone who called upon her healing light could receive its blessing. So, over the last month, Nephis was concentrating only on a small number of areas, making sure to extend her healing to everyone who needed it there. Naturally, the chosen areas were those where the bloodshed was most intense, the very tip of the subjugation crusade in the remote reaches of the Dream Realm east of the former Sword Domain, the frigid wastelands west of Raveniard, and the most perilous lengths of the Death Zone belt separating the two great human enclaves from each other. By enduring the pain of her aspect to heal as many wounded warriors as she could in these perilous areas, Nephis gave Sunny and Cassie an opportunity to find outliers among them, those awakened who were grievously wounded in one of the ceaseless battles but were not healed by the wondrous white flames. And after monitoring those outliers for a short while, as well as using Cassie's powers to stir Neph's memories of their longing, they identified several as true subjects of Astarion's domain. They were real sleeper agents that served the Dreamspawn, as opposed to those who were merely infected by his name. The discovery was quite disturbing, since there were more of them than they had suspected. None had shown any signs of being disloyal to the human domain or their comrades, either. Worse still, the hidden thralls were spread out evenly among various armies of humanity, proving that the malignant tumor of Astarion's corruption had spread too deep and too wide to be incised. And eerily, these turncoats were not showing any signs of abnormal behavior, going about their lives as if nothing was out of place. If not for their absence from the sea of flames of the longing domain, they would have never been discovered. The rest was relatively easy. Sunny sent a team of Shadow Clan members to capture one of the awakened thralls and bring him here, to this abandoned factory in NQSC. His people had accomplished the task easily, too easily, even, as June admitted. Glancing at Nephis and Cassie, he lingered for a few seconds, then asked in a quiet tone. "When is Kai arriving?" Cassie responded after a short pause. "He's already in NQSC. 5 more minutes, and he'll be here." They needed Kai's help to make sure that the thrall was telling the truth. Sunny inhaled deeply. "Well, then, shall we get some answers?" Nephis nodded somberly. "Let's get answers, indeed." 2734 Captured Thrall. A man was sitting on a cheap alloy chair in the middle of an empty room. There was a runic circle surrounding the chair, as well as enchanted shackles binding his wrists together. The circle was preventing him from summoning his memories, while the shackles were draining his essence, making it difficult to unleash his aspect. Needless to say, his expression was grim, and his eyes were full of tension. The room was largely dark, with only half of it flooded by the light of luminous memories. In front of the runic circle, another chair stood, that one was still empty, hinting that whoever had kidnapped him was not planning to get rid of the prisoner just yet, at least. He shifted uncomfortably, then looked at the heavy metal door. Is anybody there? I am not sure if you're listening, but you should know that I am a soldier of the Eastern Flame Legion. My disappearance won't go unnoticed." His warning was met with silence. Then, however, a chilling voice resounded from the darkness. "Ah, yes, somebody is indeed there. Although I doubt you'll be happy to face them, awakened Yutra." The man flinched, looking around the room wildly. He was willing to swear that there had been nobody else inside, so where was the voice coming from? Before he could say anything else, however, the door opened, and 2 women walked inside. Yutra froze, his eyes widening, an expression of stunned awe taking over his face. He literally forgot how to breathe, his gaze glued to the taller of the 2 women. His heart seemed to be on the verge of exploding. It was not every day that one met a goddess, after all. In front of him, a woman who was like a dreamlike vision of celestial radiance gracefully sat on the empty chair. Her silky skin was the color of ivory and flawlessly smooth, her silver hair glistening in the dim light like a waterfall of pure sunlight. Her striking gray eyes were like 2 placid lakes, making him feel like he was drowning in their alluring, unfathomable depths. Suddenly, Yutra sensed a sweet pain permeating his chest. He suddenly felt like a naive youth again, full of dreams and desires that were yet to be dulled by the cruel collisions with the harshness of the world. It was as if every wish and desire he harbored was ignited with an ardent fervor, making him yearn for the things he had long given up on with an almost overpowering intensity. His voice trembled. Lady Nephis. He knew who she was, of course. There was not a single person in the world who did not know Nephis of the Immortal Flame Clan, the guiding star of humanity. He had known what she looked like, as well, having seen her on countless recordings. But no recording could relay the sublime audience and divine presence of a living supreme. His shock was so great that he almost failed to register the presence of the second woman, even if hers was a beauty so delicate and beautiful that no words could describe her loveliness. She was Lady Cassia, Song of the Fallen, a renowned saint who had been serving Changing Star from before they awakened. Suddenly, Yutra was painfully aware of his outward appearance. The goddess of humanity looked so pure and wondrous, even sitting in this dirty alloy cell. He, meanwhile, had been kidnapped from his sleeping pod in the military barracks during a long and arduous military campaign. Even if the grime of the battlefield did not cling to his material body, he was still not in a presentable state. He coughed, embarrassed, then forced himself to look at Changing Star without being blinded by her marvelous appearance. She studied him calmly for a few long, surreal moments, then said in a voice that made his heart flutter like a trapped bird, "Awakened Yutra, I presume. I wish we could have met in different circumstances." Yes. Oh, I mean, yes. It was only then that Yutra remembered that he was imprisoned in a peculiar cell after being kidnapped. A deeply confused expression appeared on his face. "I beg your forgiveness, Lady Nephis. But why are you here?" For a moment, he entertained the idea that the goddess of humanity was here to rescue him personally. Could such a miracle be possible? Yutra hesitated for a moment, then asked in a quiet tone. "No, rather, why am I here? Why am I here?" Sunny felt glad that he was hidden in the shadows, having become one instead of maintaining the shape of a human. That was because if anyone could see him right now, they would have seen an expression of complete bafflement on his face. What the hell? Of all the reactions he had expected the thrall of Astarion to show, this one was definitely not one of them. The man seemed positively smitten. He looked like a devoted believer who had opened his eyes one day only to see his goddess and her high priestess right in front of him. Such a reaction, of course, was only natural for most people of the human domain, even if one disregarded the inherent presence of supremes and transcendents. Nephis and Cassie were widely renowned. Their celebrity was without a rival, so it was only expected that ordinary people would be starstruck when meeting them. Awakened Yutra, however, was not an ordinary man. He was an agent of Astarion, and therefore, both Nephis and Cassie were his enemies. Either the man was one of the best actors in the world, or he was not aware that his master and the Immortal Flame Clan were at odds, which would be strange, considering that no war could be won without letting the soldiers know who the enemy was. Nephis remained silent for a while, then asked in a calm tone. "Awakened Yutra, are you truly unaware of why you are here?" The man looked at her for a while, then shyly cleared his throat. "No, my lady, I truly have no idea." Cassie, who was standing behind Neph's shoulder, did not move. Her expression did not change, either, however, her voice resounded in Sunny's mind, sounding a little wary. He is telling the truth. Cassie, of course, was the mental link that connected them to Kai, who was standing outside the cell and listening in on the interrogation. For a moment, Sunny was unsure of himself. Did they really get the wrong guy? However, in the next moment, Nephis dispelled his doubts, crossing her legs as she pierced their prisoner with a cold look. "That is strange, because I can sense a woefully potent desire within you." Even if the man was not a part of her domain anymore, she could still feel his longing now that they were face to face. The corners of her mouth rose slightly. "The desire to serve someone other than me. To follow the will of the Dreamspawn." Having been accused of betraying the human domain, Yutra, the same man who had been starstruck and smitten by the appearance of Changing Star and Song of the Fallen, gave them an earnest, delighted smile. His voice betrayed a deep sense of excitement. "Ah, Lord Astarion. Yes, my lady, of course. Serving him well is my most ardent wish. 2735 for the greater good." The interrogation of awakened Yutra, a thrall of the Dreamspawn, was like a nightmare. Not the kind of nightmare that claws at one's heart and leaves them breathless, covered in cold sweat in the middle of a dark night, but rather the kind of nightmare that makes one feel like they are lost in the middle of a bizarre and senseless mire. A dream that makes one uncomfortable because of how peculiar and nonsensical it is. Sunny was dazed. I feel like I have a fever. Quote. I would never betray the Legion. Awakened Yutra leaned forward, momentarily forgetting even his awe in the face of the ruler of humanity out of pure outrage. Never. My lady, you experienced war as a soldier as well. You know the kind of bond that soldiers share, so, you must know that I will never betray my comrades. I would rather die. He sounded utterly sincere in his indignation. Nephis studied him for a while, then asked in an even tone. What if that was Astarion's will? Yutra had already invoked the name of the Dreamspawn, so there was no point in avoiding it anymore. Which meant that somewhere out there, Astarion was paying attention to this interrogation as well. The enthralled awakened frowned in confusion. What? Why would Lord Astarion ever? Nephis interrupted him calmly. Still, Yutra remained silent for a few moments, then shrugged. Well, it can't be helped then. As much as it pains me, my comrades would have to die. He sounded sincere now, as well. Nephis looked at Cassie, a hint of a troubled expression reflecting in her clear eyes. Cassie opened her mouth. You will sacrifice them if Astarion orders. The man gritted his teeth, visibly disturbed by the question. His answer was firm, though. Yes, but you will be pained to sacrifice them. He shuddered, then forced out in a tortured tone. Naturally I will be. How can you ask that? It will ruin me. Cassie tilted her head a little. And yet, you'll still do it. He nodded. I will. How can I not? Will you hesitate before betraying your comrades, or will you do it without hesitating at all? Yutra seemed confused once again. Why would I hesitate, if that is Lord Astarion's will? Cassie ceased her questions. Still hidden in the darkness, Sunny spoke then. Yutra. The man flinched at the sound of a disembodied voice that came from the darkness, surrounding him like a rustling tide. Sunny studied him for a few moments. You have a wife and 2 children, a son and a daughter. Correct. Yutra nodded slowly. I do, yes. Sunny smiled quietly. A famine came, and your children are starving. You only managed to procure enough food to feed 1 person, but you are hungry too. What will you do? Yutra scowled, once again unnerved by the question. He did not hesitate to answer. I will split the food evenly between my son and my daughter, and starve myself. There was no shadow of a doubt in his answer. Sunny considered him quietly, then asked another question. You and your comrades have been captured and ordered to kill one another. It's kill or be killed. What will you do? The man's scowl deepened. I'll die. I won't raise my sword against my brothers and sisters in arms. He sounded confident. How admirable. Sunny asked a third question. The feelings between you and your wife are long gone, but someone new is paying you flattering attention. What will you do? Yutra grimaced in indignation. What kind of question is that? Nothing. I'll do nothing. I will never betray my wife. And our feelings for each other are not something that can disappear one day. Sunny remained silent for a few moments, then asked in a calm tone. What if Astarion asks for the food that is meant for your children, orders you to kill your comrades, and advises you to abandon your wife? Yutra blinked a few times, then responded with the same firm confidence. Then I will let my children starve, kill whoever he wishes me to kill, and leave my wife without looking back. Naturally, the answer was a bit chilling. What was truly disturbing, however, was the man's expression. It was the very same expression he wore when vehemently denying the possibility of betraying his legion, the expression of a proud, righteous man who was valiantly stating his principles. What the hell? What the actual hell? It's creepy. The absolute lack of awareness that Yutra displayed was unnerving, and the fact that he seemed perfectly normal even when proclaiming a deranged level of devotion to Astarion was simply eerie. It was like he saw nothing wrong with what he was saying, far from it. If anything, Yutra seemed confused, uncomfortable even, with the fact that his interrogators were somehow failing to understand something that he deemed self-evident. Why? Yutra frowned. What do you mean? Sunny sighed. Why would you choose Astarion over your wife, children, and comrades? The man remained silent for a while, as if he had never stopped to think about it before. Eventually, his frown disappeared, and he smiled. Because of the greater good. His smile was pale, but blissful. Yutra inhaled slowly, then spoke in a subdued tone. I can't describe how much I love my family and value my fellow soldiers. But that is just me, it is the private love and loyalty of a small, simple man. There has to be something greater in your life if you wish to live nobly, though. A greater purpose that goes beyond your personal attachments. Like the survival of all mankind, of everyone's families and everyone's comrades. He leaned back and looked at Nephis happily. That is why I am devoted to Lord Astarion. Because he is our best hope of survival, mankind's hope. He is the greater good. Sunny could not help but laugh silently. Oh, gods, the irony. Didn't what Yutra was trying to describe sound a lot like conviction, because of the greater good, huh? 2,736 contaminated values. The interrogation continued for quite a while, producing the same nonsensical responses. Awakened Yutra was an upstanding man. He might not have been a powerful man, but in the modest degree of talent and opportunity afforded to him, he was outstanding. He was a loving husband and a father, a reliable friend to his fellow awakened, and a valiant soldier of the human domain. Everything he told them about himself fit the information they had gathered beforehand perfectly, and Kai did not sense any lies in what the man said either. He was a good and loyal man. Except, of course, for the fact that in Yutra's mind, there was now nothing more important than Lord Astarion, his supposed greater good. His devotion to the Dreamspawn was absolute, trumping all other values and principles. He was not an immoral man, quite the opposite, but his morality made an exception for everything connected to Astarion. He was not an irrational man either, but his reason failed every time Astarion was mentioned, and he was not even capable of realizing that his thoughts and opinions were unreasonable. It was disturbing, precisely because Yutra was otherwise a perfectly sane and rational person. When asked more detailed questions, he became momentarily confused, then easily came up with improvised answers that fit his twisted view of the world. Yutra did not know that much about the subject of his eerie devotion, even if he himself did not realize it. He seemed to vaguely know that Astarion was a supreme, but not how the Dreamspawn had attained supremacy or what powers he wielded. Yutra did not quite remember how he had come to be dedicated to Astarion, or when. Most of all, he had not the slightest idea of what Astarion's plans were, or what his own role in bringing those plans to fruition was supposed to be. All he could do was smile creepily and repeat incomprehensible words: togetherness, communion, salvation for all. He did not know the identities of the other thralls of Astarion, either. Of course, he didn't. After all, he did not even know that he himself was enthralled. Rather, he seemed to assume that everyone shared his beliefs, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Nothing they said or did managed to shake his devotion even a little bit. Eventually, they left Yutra alone and retreated from the chamber. Kai met them outside the cell, wearing a disturbed expression on his handsome face. He is completely insane. They had been disturbed by the bizarre conversation with Yutra, but Kai had to have suffered much more, considering that he sensed that everything the thrall spoke was true, or at least that he sincerely believed it to be true. Sunny coalesced into a human shape and gave his friend a long look. It would have been fine if he was insane. The problem is that he is much too sane, instead. Nefis nodded. His mental faculties are all there. It is just that, the source data has been replaced. The complicated machine of Yurta's mind was functioning the way it was supposed to. However, the foundation it was built upon, his beliefs and principles, had been tampered with. So, the entire output was utterly contaminated. Nefis remained silent for a while, frowning. Eventually, she only said one word. Troublesome. Sunny tended to agree. He's completely brainwashed, which is a new kind of problem, at least in my unfortunate experience. He sighed. Mind attacks had always been the most insidious, and enemies who could employ them had always been the most dangerous. However, he had never really encountered quite this level of mental manipulation. Usually, thralls were either mindless or directly controlled by their masters. Yutra, however, was neither mindless nor controlled. Astarion was not pulling his strings. There was no need to, because Yutra was not a puppet. He was a completely free and independent individual, a person who still had his agency, and chose to serve the Dreamspawn simply because that was what he believed to be right. Even if his beliefs had been tainted by insidious manipulation. We've encountered such a problem before. You should have, too. Cassie's voice was calm, but somber. Sunny looked at her in surprise. We have, she nodded. When Nefis and I were sleepers, we fell under a mind hex of a profane tree. It twisted our beliefs, albeit not in quite as sophisticated a manner as what the Dreamspawn have achieved. The result was just as effective, though. You burned that tree while exploring the Forgotten Shore years later. So, this problem is not entirely new. Sunny's eyes widened a little. Oh, you're right. That tree possessed a Simula-G kind of power, indeed. Nefis tilted her head slightly. The Soul Devourer had to have been a corrupted sapling of Heart God's sacred tree. The Dreamspawn inherited the lineage of Heart God, as well. What a curious connection. Sunny raised an eyebrow. Heart God. The god of souls, emotions, growth, memories, and hunger. Kai looked at Nephis, then asked in a contemplative tone. How did the two of you escape the mind hex, all those years ago? Nephis looked at Cassie, remained silent for a while, then looked down. Quote. I don't quite remember. Nephis and Cassie might not have remembered, but Sunny did. How had they escaped the soul devourer? Through a fated combination of Cassie's prophetic warning, Neph's stubbornness, Sunny's relentless spitefulness, and a drop of Weaver's blood. He did not think that fate would save them again, though. Both because Astarion was incalculably more powerful than the soul devourer had ever been, and because he was not fated anymore. Don't quite remember. Sunny looked at Cassie, studied her for a while, and then asked in a casual tone, considering that the Dreamspawn put tainted data into Yutra's head, can't you just erase it? Cassie remained silent for a moment. You want me to tamper with his memories? Sunny nodded. I want you to wash away his brainwashing. It's not like we haven't considered that option before. Astarion's true power spreads through knowledge, and one of us can erase knowledge from people's heads. Wouldn't it be foolish not to try using that to our advantage? Cassie turned her head to face him and frowned slightly. The only problem is that I will be exposed to the same knowledge while trying to erase it. She lingered for a short while, then shrugged. What I mean to say is, it's worth a try. 2737 War of Ideas. They returned to the cell in concerned silence. Sunny was still hidden in the shadows, having assumed his natural form. He studied Yutra carefully, paying attention to the exhaustion written on the man's face. My lady, I don't understand why you are doing this to me. Yutra's hoarse voice was full of confusion. He glanced at Nephis with fatigued reverence in his eyes. Then, however, a hint of something dark ignited in them, and after hesitating for a long while, he said in a hollow tone, unless, of course, you harbor malice against Lord Astarion. Against the greater good for all of mankind. His pupils widened in terror at the implications of his bold suspicion. No, it can't be. Sunny had been feeling uneasy all along, but now, he was suddenly full of dark apprehension. Was this Astarion's real goal? Was he not simply aiming to bewitch subjects of the human domain to fuel his source element, but also planning to turn them against the very woman who ruled them? There was only one leap of logic between being devoted to the Dreamspawn and loathing his enemies, after all. Was Astarion building an army out of Neph's very own soldiers? He has to be. Does that mean that we will have to slaughter our own soldiers to destroy his army? Sunny was troubled. Nephis, meanwhile, regarded Yutra silently for a while. Then, unexpected a soft smile graced her lips. Do you know, awakened Yutra, I've known Astarion personally since I was a little child. Yutra stared at her in shock. Then, his eyes ignited with a sense of awe. Why, you have met Lord Astarion? Really? Nephis nodded. Of course. I used to call him Uncle Astar. We were quite close. She took the alloy chair and moved it out of the way. And later, when Valor and Song conspired to kill me, I heard that it was my Uncle Astar who kept them at bay. Yutra's eyes shone as he nodded energetically. Of course he would. Nephis sighed and glanced up with the same soft smile on her lips. I used to think he was the greatest, too. Then, she turned her gaze to Yutra. I know he is listening right now. I am glad he is. She entered the runic circle, walked around the shackled man, and placed her hands on his shoulders. Leaning down, Nephis remained silent for a moment and then spoke softly into his ear. It took 3 of them to kill my father, even when they stabbed him in the back. Anvil and Kisong have already been dealt with. They died too quickly, though, so, I am glad that Astarion cannot be destroyed, as well. He'll long to be able to die, one day soon. Before Yutra could react, she grabbed his head and held it in place. What are you? Cassie was already stepping into the runic circle, pulling her blindfold down. Sunny was behind her, so he did not see what her transcendent ability had turned her eyes into. He could see Yutra flinch in utter horror as he beheld them, though. Then, the enthralled soldier's terrified expression slowly slackened, turning into one of mesmerized wonder, as if he was witnessing something both tantalizing and breathtakingly gorgeous. Sunny was faintly disturbed by the scene. Damn it, why is everyone so creepy? Cassie stood motionlessly above the mesmerized awakened, her golden hair moving subtly in the wind that blew through the underground cell thanks to a derelict ventilation system. Everything else was still and motionless, swallowed by a cold silence. Neither Sunny nor Nephis could perceive what was happening in Yutra's mind, where Cassie's power was currently waging a war against the insidious influence of the Dreamspawn. However, they knew that a daunting battle was happening close to them, hidden from view. Sunny did not like the feeling of not being able to help, to do anything notable, really. It was an unfamiliar and unpleasant feeling, one he had not experienced in a long while. The same feeling, in a broader sense, was connected to everything having to do with Astarion. He felt like all his power was useless in the face of this particular adversary. Making Sunny feel powerless before the adversary had even revealed himself was quite an achievement, and he could not help but grit his teeth. A few minutes later, Cassie let out a quiet groan. Nefis glanced at her tensely, then asked with a hint of concern. "Are you all right?" Cassie remained silent for a short while, then answered flatly. "I'm fine. Delving into the mind of the Dreamspawn's thrall is like opening myself to a vicious mind attack. It is like walking through a minefield, intentionally stepping on each mine. But I am handling it. Now." Sunny was a bit concerned, too. "You are handling a mental attack of a Supreme," Cassie responded after a short delay. "I am incapable of repelling an assault of a Supreme. So while I am erasing the memories of Yutra, I am erasing my own memories of having erased them at the same time. Thus, I am dodging the attack and keeping my mind free of contaminated knowledge." Sunny fell silent, quietly impressed. He was sure that manipulating the memories of a person was not an easy task, so doing that while also editing her own memories must have been more than a little difficult. Still, Cassie was handling it with seeming ease. The process continued for a while, each minute more tense than the previous one. Yutra's expression of wonder slowly dimmed, replaced by a strained grimace. He was as pale as a ghost, with beads of sweat glistening on his skin. Then, gradually, his grimace disappeared, and he slowly looked away from Cassie. He seemed spent, disoriented, and dazed. She let out a long sigh. After remaining silent for a few seconds, Cassie said quietly, "It's done. I think it's done." She pulled her blindfold back in place and took several steps back. His first memory of the Dreamspawn appeared only a few days after the conclusion of the war in Godgrave. "I tried to be surgical in which memories I erased, but, as his condition worsened, every minute of his life seemed to be contaminated. I had no choice but to erase it all." Just as she finished speaking, a weak voice resounded in the underground cell. Where am I?" Yutra was looking around, anxious and confused. Sunny felt a hint of sympathy for the man. Coming to his senses with no memories of the past couple of years, chained to a chair. Inside a runic circle, had to be quite a shock. Nefis calmly released the man's head and walked around the chair to stand in front of him. "Awakened Yutra, I presume." His eyes widened. Lady Nefis." Sunny felt a sense of déjà vu. Soon enough, a soothing white light ignited under Yutra's skin, healing his scrapes and bruises. Having been stolen from the longing domain by the Dreamspawn, he was now healed and returned to the embrace of the immortal flame. Even if he had been robbed of a vast swath of his memories, having lost a short span of his life forever. Not long after, Sunny, Nefis, Cassie, and Kai were gathered on the floor of the abandoned factory, standing in a small circle. A somber silence hung between them, interrupted only by the rustle of the old air filters. Eventually, Sunny asked in a dark tone, "How many thralls can you cure in a day?" Cassie sighed, then lowered her head a little. "It doesn't take a lot of time, but my reserves of essence are not endless. A few, possibly a dozen, if I exhaust myself." A dozen. With the speed at which the infection was spreading and new thralls were being initiated into Astarion's domain, a dozen was woefully not enough. "We can't keep doing nothing." Saying that, Sunny glanced at Nefis. "I know that cracking down on small cults only makes them spread faster, but since our adversary is an idea, we have no choice but to engage in ideological warfare. Strict censorship, criminal persecution of dissidents, political repression, we'll have to engage in all of those, and more." He sighed. "At the very least, we must isolate those who preach the name of the Dreamspawn to the masses. That won't stop him, but it will slow him down." Nefis looked at him for a while, remaining silent. Eventually, she asked, "Are you suggesting that I start hunting down heretics? Those who denounce me in favor of a different god? What next, then? Should I start burning them at the stake?" If she did, the words immortal flame would attain a much darker meaning. Sunny frowned. "Hey, there's no need to be that extreme. I am sure that we can build a comfortable camp or two for these people." Nefis exhaled slowly. "We are building camps now. Do you even hear yourself?" Sunny studied her for a short while, then smiled. Nephews, we might have won the war against the sovereigns, but now, we are facing a paranormal insurgency led by a supreme who does not even consider himself to be human. There's no time for half measures anymore. Things are going to start happening fast from now on, so we should forget the false assumption that we hold an advantage and start acting far more desperate. Nephews lingered for a long while. In the end, she sighed. Fine, let's stop doing nothing, then. 2738 speeding toward the end. The being that used to be Song of the Fallen abandoned the dark memory, still painted in grim shades by the feelings of powerlessness and apprehension captured in it. It was a little sad and a little uncomfortable, to witness someone as fearsome as the Lord of Shadows feeling so stumped and restrained. The Lord of Shadows, his memories were odd and eerie, permeated by a staggering vastness of his consciousness and an alien kind of perception that very few beings shared. She vaguely remembered being strained by sharing his senses, and even now, it was too easy to get lost in them. The Lord of Shadows was vast and powerful, but even he had been restrained by the quiet, insidious conquest of the Dreamspawn. This man, Yutra, he was the first. But he had not been the last. Knowing what to look for now, she extended the tendrils of her will toward countless memories, those that belonged to her, and those that did not, assembling them into a narrative of what had followed the eerie interrogation. The world was changing at a startling speed, guided by its ruinous star toward the inevitable final clash against the nightmare. They were all so terribly busy, having to put out countless fires that ignited all across the dream realm and the waking world each day, all the while planning and building for the quickly approaching, frightening future. One world was already being swallowed by the other. Even if the process was only just beginning, the consequences could already be felt. The distance between various areas, which had seemed impermeable, was changing. The powerful nightmare creatures that used to dwell in remote death zones were stirring, some of them already starting to migrate toward the human borders. The waking world was not unscathed, either. The number of nightmare gates that opened across its desolate expanse was steadily increasing. The logistical infrastructure of humanity was slowly crumbling under the strain, but even that was not the most immediate concern. The most impactful crisis was developing due to something that nobody had expected. It was the fact that the average temperature across the planet had dropped by a couple of degrees compared to the previous years. That was the result of the cold from the frigid wastelands west of Ravenheart seeping through the torn realm boundary. The consequences were not disastrous yet, but they were a promise of the dire madness of the approaching years. That only made it more apparent how important it was to safely resettle as many people as possible, all of them, ideally, into the dream realm before the collapse began. However, that titanic undertaking itself was plagued by numerous problems. At the moment, the human territories in the dream realm were simply incapable of receiving that many settlers. They were all developing with astonishing speed, and yet that speed was not sufficient. There was electricity in Bastion, and Ravenheart was on the verge of ushering in an agricultural revolution. However, the local infrastructure was barely managing to sustain hundreds of millions of people, having almost reached a bottleneck in scalability. It was far from being ready to sustain billions. Now, more than ever, humanity needed as many awakened with useful utility aspects. Myriad awakened and masters made the rapid development of the human civilization in the dream realm possible, while some of the saints were like industries in and of themselves. Saint Bliss would soon be responsible for feeding myriads of humans. Beastmaster single-handedly hastened the expansion of human civilization in the basin of the River of Tears Manifold. Nightwalker, whose return caused a worldwide sensation, was taking charge of all naval navigation in both the Stormsia and across the deadly oceans of Earth. Saint Thane, the dream merchant, was on the verge of connecting disparate human enclaves in the dream realm through a new iteration of the dreamscape, thus making nearly instant communication across vast distances possible. Granted, there were many entities in the dream realm that could intrude upon the shared dreams of awakened, so this connection was far from safe yet. Even with more than 1 million awakened serving the human domain, there were never enough hands to handle all the demanding tasks of building a new home for humanity. Therefore, countless mundane people were working tirelessly for the shared goal. As well, their contributions were no less important, and perhaps even more so. There were far more mundane people than there were awakened, after all. That meant that they had to be responsible for completing the lion's share of the work. That also meant that there were far more exceptional individuals among them, and even if their strength was not on par with those chosen by the nightmare spell, their minds were just as brilliant. Mundane people could step up and take responsibility for the endless task of building and feeding the growing human civilization of the dream realm, But, sadly, they could not carry the many military burdens of the human domain. Even if the civil war between the domains was over, war continued to rage on all sides. If humans wanted to live in the dream realm had to be subjugated. The vast territories taken by the awakened of previous generations had to be tamed, while new territories had to be explored, cleansed, and conquered. United and inspired by Changing Star, humanity worked feverishly to ensure its own survival. Song of the Fallen was Changing Star's right-hand woman, and therefore quite possibly the busiest person in existence. However, soon after the interrogation of awakened Yutra, a new duty was added to her list of important responsibilities. It was the task of liberating enthralled humans from the clutches of the Dreamspawn. The abandoned factory in the outskirts of NQSC became a temporary quarantine facility where those proven to be Asterian's thralls were brought by the agents of the Shadow Clan and kept until she could purify their minds. The work was slow and exhausting, and worst of all, none of them knew for sure if it was making a difference or added up to nothing but a drop in the ocean. Song of the Fallen was not the only awakened who possessed powers that could affect or cure the thralls. There were myriad unique aspects out there. After all, there were also an endless sea of memories and people capable of weaving sorcery, so she could have found and recruited a team of helpers to assist her in the task. However, the very nature of their enemy prevented her from doing so. Everyone who encountered the thralls ran the risk of becoming enraptured by the Dreamspawn themselves, after all, so only those who could resist his influence could be allowed to face them. And there was no other person except Cassia who could both eliminate Asterian's malignant influence and stay free of it. So, her time and soul essence became the bottleneck in their struggle against the spread of the Hunger Domain. Cassia's efforts were not the only steps Changing Star and the Lord of Shadows were undertaking to combat Asterian's silent conquest, of course. 2739 Quarantine Measures. Asterian could not be killed. However, an immortal adversary was not that novel, as far as Changing Star and the Lord of Shadows were concerned. Both of them could hardly be destroyed, as well, and the same went for the Fourth Supreme, the King of Nothing. All that meant was that the Dreamspawn would have to be defeated and sealed, just like he had been sealed once by Anvil and Key Song. No, rather, he would have to be sealed far better than the first sovereigns had managed, so that his sinister influence never infected humanity again. Therefore, the invisible war of influence that Asterian had declared on Changing Star and her domain was going to end in an open confrontation eventually. So, before then, they had one primary task, to make sure that the Longing Domain was not weakened too much, while the Hunger Domain remained as weak as possible. At the same time, they had to prevent Asterian from harming humanity to the best of their ability. It was already apparent that he was intending to hold mankind hostage in his conflict against them. Or, at least, it seemed that way. In truth, Asterian's motives remained a mystery, just like most things about him did. In any case, Sunny and Nephis needed to slow down the spread of Asterian's influence and disarm as many of his thralls as they could. The Hunger Domain's silent and disturbingly unnoticeable growth seemed unstoppable, and the Dreamspawn was becoming more powerful with each day, but even if it seemed that they weren't making any progress, in truth, their position was improving as well. That was because they were gradually learning more and more about the adversary. By now, they knew enough to take action. While humanity was their weakness, it was also their greatest resource. Innumerable talented individuals were mobilized to develop means of recognizing members of the Hunger Domain without truly knowing what they were working on, or why. That way, they were not at risk of becoming infected themselves. While sorcerers and spellsmiths were working on a tool to identify Asterian's sleeper agents, Sunny and Nephis directed their attention to the fringe organizations that had already been discovered as carriers of the Dreamspawn's will. Sunny had described the conflict they found themselves in as ideological warfare. While not as familiar to them as ferocious and lethal combat, that type of strife was not new to those born of the war realm, either. In fact, humanity had a rich and bloody history of waging wars of ideas, most boasting death tolls in no way inferior to conventional military campaigns. So, if they wished to, they could open the bottomless toolbox of history and borrow a harrowing array of strategies to crush an idea championed by the adversary, as well as those who carried it. However, Sunny's careless description was not entirely fitting. Yes, Asterian was as much an idea as he was a man, and his powers spread through human thought. However, the idea of Asterian was not a mundane one, it was an expression of his supreme will. Therefore, it was an idea so perilous and virulent that merely being exposed to it meant becoming infected by it. Which meant that most tried and tested strategies of ideological warfare were meaningless in front of the Dreamspawn. That said, Astarion's power was not absolute, either. After all, not all of those who had become infected by the idea of him were turned into his thralls, which proved that the Dreamspawn was limited in how many people he could subjugate. That limit, most likely, was the difference between his personal power and the mental resistance of his prey. Sunny and Nefis deduced that last point after observing the first few thralls the Shadow Clan captured. The person's resistance against mind attacks mattered, but what seemed to matter even more was their mental state. Depending on how firmly one believed in changing star in the human domain, the difficulty of penetrating the defenses of their mind could either increase or diminish. In other words, they needed to make sure that as few people as possible were exposed to the idea of Astarion. At the same time, they needed to strengthen people's belief in the human domain, so that fewer of those who did end up learning the name of Astarion became his thralls. And lastly, they needed to isolate the thralls to prevent them from spreading the Dreamspawn's name further. That was where they discovered another trap laid out for them by Astarion. That wicked bastard. Sunny let out a frustrated scoff as he stared at the list of targets in front of him. They needed to eradicate the sleeper agent cells that were helping the plague of Astarion spread, like the Church of the Moon, which was rapidly gaining popularity in the former territory of the Sword Domain. However, by coming down on this cult and other ones like it, they would be creating an impression of tyrannical authority that did not tolerate dissenting opinions or afford the people the freedom of thought. Therefore, they would be weakening the belief of the people in the virtue and power of the human domain, making numerous humans more susceptible to the infection. Looking up, he let out a heavy sigh. The forces of the Immortal Flame Clan could not be seen persecuting seemingly harmless cultists, so it was decided that the Shadow Clan would handle the dismantling of Astarion's sleeper cells. His agents were already positioned to handle that kind of work, anyway, since they were supposed to be the shadow of the unblemished Firekeepers. Naturally, he was not planning on slaughtering the unfortunate souls that fell under the Dreamspawn's influence. Some of them were thralls, while some were merely misguided fools. The former had to be delivered to the quarantine facility in NQSC, while the latter had to be isolated until Astarion was dealt with. Distinguishing the thralls from simple cultists was quite difficult at the moment, though. So, all the prisoners would have to be held somewhere. For now, Sunny had already built a comfortable, but quite inescapable village for them outside the walls of the Dark City. With so many people vanishing without a trace, the citizens of the human domain would understandably become disturbed. Their confidence in Nefis would diminish, somewhat, but it was still better than an open campaign of repression. Letting out a sigh, Sunny rubbed his eyes. Look at me, planning to kidnap thousands of people. He was not very happy about this turn of events. Still, it had to be done. The problem was that the Shadow Clan only had a few hundred members, and Sunny himself was spread a little bit too thin. He needed help if he was going to accomplish this task, and numerous other tasks to come, cleanly. I guess it's time to get myself a capable lieutenant. 2740 Dark Lord's top lieutenant. Most of the Shadow Clan members were awakened, with only a few masters mixed in. Sunny planned to slowly nurture the talented people he had recruited, and then send those who were ready to conquer nightmares. That way, he would eventually come to rule a small army of elite ascended specialists. Some of his agents were already planning to challenge the second nightmare. Tamar of Sorrow, for example, was preparing to take Ray, Fleur, Corsair, and Telly of White Feather, all of a sudden, into a seed. However, there were things that even Ascended could not do. Carrying people across the realm boundary, for one, that was in the purview of saints. As a supreme titan, Serpent could theoretically place the mark of shadows on transcendent beings, as well, and Sunny's life would have become much easier if he had recruited one or two. However, there were reasons why he had never tried to initiate a saint into the Shadow Clan. Firstly, he did not really need to. It was not like he controlled citadels that had to be bestowed upon loyal saints to empower his domain. Sunny had 7 incarnations, after all, but only 2 citadels. So, unless he suddenly came into possession of 6 more, he had no need of a vassal. More importantly, though, he could not allow himself to become a master of too many powerful living beings. It was fine if his legion of shadows kept growing, but if enough humans who had climbed high on the path of ascension began to follow him, the forgotten god would come closer to awakening. Still, things constantly changed, and at this point, Sunny needed the assistance of a saint. He needed someone who was competent, would fit into the Shadow Legion, and whose absence would not weaken the longing domain too much. That last requirement was especially stringent. It made it so he could not poach Effie, Kai, or Jet from Nefis. Even someone like Nightwalker was out of the question, for better or worse. However, Sunny did have a perfect candidate in mind. Ah, I really don't like this place. Escorted by Saint through a dark corridor, Sunny barely held back a shiver. It was terribly cold down here, and on top of that, his shadow sense was suppressed. Those demons all must have been wary of Shadow God and his servants. Many of the strongholds they had left behind had a way of making his perception nearly useless, as if he were an ordinary being. The Jade Palace was no different. One of Sunny's incarnations was hidden in Ravenheart, so visiting the Great Citadel was quite simple. He often did, either to help Kai, or to annoy him out of boredom. Today, however, Sunny had left the opulence of the upper levels of the Jade Palace behind and delved into the network of tunnels beneath it. His goal, of course, was to find the reclusive saint who dwelled there. These were the ice halls, where Ki Song had kept her legion of pilgrims once. A questionable choice of residence, as far as Sunny was concerned, but then again, he lived inside a gluttonous devil. Soon enough, the tunnel Sunny and Saint were following opened into a vast open chamber, and he suddenly lost his ability to see. That was because the chamber was drowned in true darkness, the element that the person who lived here freely controlled. Strangely enough, the cold wrecked as soon as he entered the chamber, and a warm wind caressed his face. Sunny cleared his throat. I am sorry to come in without knocking. But, you know, there's no door. So, I let myself in. A few moments passed in eerie silence, and then, a voice resounded from the dark, sounding somber and cold. The Lord of Shadows, to what do I owe the displeasure? Still blind, Sunny smiled. Oh, you know, I need help kidnapping 1,000 or so people. You were the first person I thought I'd ask. There was a long stretch of silence, and then Revel responded in a tone that lacked amusement. Get out. Sunny sighed, then turned in the direction where Saint stood silently. Saint, if you will. In the next moment, the darkness around him seemed to ripple. Then, it retreated, revealing the vast underground chamber to him in all its. Sunny had not really put much thought into imagining how the Lightslayer's lair looked, but he sort of imagined a grim hall devoid of all comfort. A cold and dark crypt where Arivel sat on the stone floor, endlessly meditating, or maybe a rough and stark training field where she honed her battle art. The underground chamber he saw after the true darkness retreated, though, was a bit cozy, and more than a little untidy. There was plenty of expensive furniture, including a bed with a tall mattress and a fluffy blanket, takeout boxes and junk food wrappers strewn around the place, a battery of empty soda cans, and tall piles of books standing here and there, every item clearly dragged here from the waking world. Some of the book piles had even toppled, spreading them across the floor. One of the books was laying right near his foot. Leaning down, Sunny picked it up and looked at the cover with a confused frown. I didn't mean to seduce the Northern Duke. He blinked a couple of times, failing to comprehend what he had just read. Give that back. Someone snatched the book out of his hand, and he finally saw Revel, who was staring angrily at him. Dark Dancer Revel looked like she always did. Her skin was pure alabaster, her eyes seemed to be cut from precious obsidian, and her hair was like a waterfall of beautiful black silk. It was just that her silken hair was gathered in a messy bun, and she was wearing a pair of stretched-out sweatpants and a raggedy, threadbare sweatshirt. The former princess of Song hid the book behind her back and turned the scathing gaze of her black eyes toward Saint. Since when is that thing supreme? Saint had been able to vanquish the true darkness because she was of a higher rank than Revel, and therefore could exert greater authority over the element they were both attuned to. Sunny was still staring at Revel with a dumbfounded expression. Since winter. It was Revel the Lightslayer, all right. Revel was a slob. And an aficionado of questionable novels, as well. Sunny was suddenly full of doubts. Come to think of it, do I really need a lieutenant?